I've been keeping introductions deliberately very, very brief since I stumble over even the simplest ones. And when I asked Sue how she wanted to be introduced, she said something very short, and I'll introduce her that way. But before I introduce her that way, I want to give my own longer introduction, which is just slightly longer, and it's that Sue, besides being Shawn Brant's wife and the mom of 2 kids with Shawn, is also a phenomenal organizer in her own right. And if we're talking about a panel of really strong women, is definitely one of the women that a bunch of us in this room looked up to when we were younger and continue to look up to for inspiration and for, well, if I say guidance, you'll probably get charged with something, so. Anyway, here's Sue.
I want to start tonight, I think just by acknowledging Gary's family, his wife and his kids. I don't expect the whole speech to be this hard, but what you said, you know, brought a lot of things home for me, and I take strength from that. And our family certainly, I think, is, you know, we acknowledge at the beginning of a long road, and I think it's one, you know, I don't want to jinx myself, but that I would anticipate, you know, would be somewhat shorter than yours in the end. And I think it takes tremendous courage to do what you guys have done and to continue to do it, you know, for the past 3 years. And I just think it's very important to acknowledge that. When we talked about speaking order tonight, I must admit I was given some leeway, and perhaps if I had known what Naomi was going to say, I might have said maybe I should go first. But as it is, I think you're going to have to listen to a lot of the same stuff twice. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing or some kind of bizarre coincidence. It's because that's what we're dealing with. She mentioned Shawn as a spokesperson. You know, culturally within the Mohawk Nation, he wouldn't be called a leader within his community. That's just not a culturally appropriate term. What he is the spokesperson, initially for protesters at the quarry. The quarry is, well, it's a quarry. It's an aggregate located on Mohawk land. On land that is under claim currently, that the federal government has acknowledged is Mohawk land, and has been trucking out 300 plus truckloads of gravel per month until March, when after a 60-day warning period, members of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte shut it down. And Shawn acted as a spokesperson for that, and very, as Naomi said, eloquently, you know, put it on the table what the dynamic was, and that really all people were asking for was a fair and level playing field at the negotiating table. Hooray! It's a, you know, I mean, it's a ridiculously simple request. You know, you couldn't have a more reasonable demand that you don't greatly alter the landscape, you don't truck away the very land that you're talking about. But what happened, I think, beyond March, as the campaign continued, is that Shawn ceased to be the spokesperson only for the quarry. And he became the spokesperson for the 300 communities that drink polluted water. You know, and the moms who bathe their kids in that water that would just as likely make them sick as it would make them clean. He became the spokesperson, you know, for all those communities dealing with the suicide crisis. You know, overwhelming, crushing poverty And he put those things out in such a way that somehow, I think you could argue perhaps for the first time, Canadians got past, what a lot of politicians might call rhetoric or basic stats, and felt a real connection to the suffering. He put a face on the suffering that exists. And that's something that the government doesn't like. In 2004, Indian Affairs new minister at that time, Andy Mitchell, was given a document, and it was secured under Freedom of Information, of course heavily censored. Nevertheless, I think the nuts and bolts are still, out there for us to look at. It said that Indian Affairs should seek less press on Native issues. That Aboriginal issues are traditionally, and I quote here, traditionally a low priority for the Canadian public unless the media forces public attention on them. The papers added that news coverage focuses on flashpoints, diminishing the public's perception of the department's work. The media's focus on conflict, accountability, and the persistence of poor socioeconomic conditions among Aboriginal people exacerbate this perception. So it's in their interest to keep these things quiet. They are sitting on a legacy of horrific abuse, of subhuman conditions that in 2007 people continue to live in. And they want to keep that quiet. By their own admission, a conservative senator, Senator St. Germain, in December 2006, he released a report that studied specifically the land claim process, but took into account the wider crisis. And he concluded that it's cheaper to keep people talking. It's cheaper to keep people at the negotiating table and go on with years and years of stalling and et cetera, than deal with the injustices that are brought before them, regardless of whether the government has already said that they are valid claims. He also issued a warning to his government. He said, inaction or maintaining the status quo is not acceptable. It's breeding violence. The First Nations of Canada have been incredibly patient. Some of them have waited 3 or 4 decades for the resolution of their claims. And I think that when Shawn was able, as I say, to personalize this and to make Canadians care whether Aboriginal kids were living or were dying, that was incredibly dangerous to the government in 2 ways. Firstly, there's a lot of talk about, and I can remember Shawn being asked this question over and over and over again. Are you not concerned that these types of actions will alienate public support? Are you not concerned by that? And I remember what Shawn would answer. He would say, our babies are dying. They're drinking polluted water. They're living in houses where people have to rip the siding off in the winter just so they don't freeze to death. And that's the status quo, and no one has cared enough to force a count on their government at this point. So what exactly are we worried about alienating? But I'll tell you, even beyond that, I don't think people were alienated. In fact, I think it went the exact opposite direction.